I want to talk to you about climate change and how it affects what we are eating and vice versa. So I want to begin by telling you that he called me Dr. Rao. When I was at Stanford working on my PhD, I saw a cartoon saying, "Are you a real doctor or are you just a mere PhD?" So I'm a systems scientist. And I got my doctorate in electrical engineering, and I worked on the internet infrastructure for the first 20 years after I graduated from school. And then in 2005, I happened to see Al Gore's presentation on TV. And I was so shocked by what he was saying that I said to myself, if half of what he's saying is true, what is everybody doing? We should all be working on this full time. So I told my wife this, and she said, if you think it is that important, why don't you work on it? So she gave me that permission. So I started looking into it, and within 3 months I realized that it is far worse than what he says. So to put that in perspective, let me give you an analogy. Imagine that you wake up one morning and you discover a lump the size of a grapefruit by the side of your head and a mild fever of 1 degree Celsius. And you go to the doctor. The doctor examines you and he says, oh, that lump is cancerous and it's causing your fever. So I'm going to prescribe you Tylenol so that the fever doesn't go over 2 degrees Celsius as your cancer doubles. Would you at that point be more concerned about your fever or your cancer? But that's exactly how our world leaders have been treating climate change and the earth. They talk about the fever. They talk about whether or not to give Tylenol for the fever. One side says, yes, you have to give Tylenol for the fever. And the other side says, no, the earth can take it. In the meantime, they have both agreed that the cancer must grow. If you read the Paris Climate Agreement of 192 nations who signed it, they are determined to double the size of the global economy by 2100. How do you do that? The economy is already 60% larger than what the earth can support. How is that possible? So I started Climate Healers in 2007 because I wanted to address the cancer as well as the fever. It's about healing the earth. It's healing the climate, reversing climate change. The tagline is healing earth from the inside out because it has to begin with each one of us. Recently, Gus Speth, who is one of the foremost environmental scientists in the world, he was being interviewed and he said that 30 years ago, I thought that the 3 major environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystems collapse, and climate change. And that with 30 years of good science, we can solve these problems. I was wrong. The 3 major environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to solve them, you need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. See, even though I call myself a systems scientist, I'm really an engineer. And engineers like to solve problems. So I started looking into how do we do this spiritual and cultural transformation. Spiritual transformation means that you have to change yourself. That's an inner change that has to happen. And a cultural transformation means that you have to change how we relate to each other and how we relate to the environment. And the environment, what is the environment? The environment is full of animals and birds and trees and plants. All the other life forms on earth, they are our fellow earthlings. So how do we relate to them? So that is the transformation we are talking about. There's a book by Jeremy Lent that came out recently. I think it's maybe 4 months ago. And it's called The Patterning Instinct. So it talks about how we as a species look at patterns in nature and we tell stories based on that. And then we identify our story, and based on our story we act. So we have personal stories and we have common stories that we all agree upon. So in that book he says there are 3 possible futures for humanity. The first future is a complete chaos of civilization. And no one really works for something like that. No one tells a story where we are going to create a Mad Max scenario. Right? The second future he talks about is the techno split, which is an extreme inequality between haves and have-nots. Some people have everything and others have nothing. And if you look at what our civilization is doing now, that's where we are headed towards. That's where the majority of people are working towards, based on the stories that we are bought into. So the second scenario, I call it the Hunger Games scenario. And the third is the great transition, or the great transformation. So this great transformation is towards a life-affirming global culture, from the life-destroying culture we have today. And we are all in this together. This is global. This is not just a few people here and there who have to do this. All of us have to be involved in this. See, we talk about climate change as one of the major environmental issues on Earth right today. And it is a major issue. It is the fever that the Earth has. And it's caused by our greenhouse gas emissions, right? But let me put that in perspective. So for the average human being, the amount of greenhouse gases we emit is like having 2 elephants in your house every year. 2 extra elephants of CO2. So if you imagine that you live in a world where you have to keep all your waste with you. So for everything in your home, you need to have 70 times as much by weight of trash, because that's how much trash was produced for that object, on average. But on average, every one of us is producing 10 elephants worth of toxic chemical waste every year. But no one talks about all those, they only talk about the CO2. So the framing of our environmental problems is also based on selfishness and greed and apathy. This is why we only focus on climate change, because it affects the rich people first. So it's about storytelling, and what kind of stories we tell about ourselves, and what kind of stories we tell that is common among us. And the best I can do is to tell you my story, and how I came to the conclusions I came to, so that you can form your own stories. So I'm going to begin in 1993. I was deeply involved in this culture. I bought this big home in New Jersey because I was doing very well in my business. I bought this big home and then I bought a brand new car, parked it in my garage, and the next morning it burnt my house down. So that was a wake-up call. He burned my house down, so I called the dealer and I asked him, "What did you sell me? It's supposed to be a brand new car." And he said, "Oh my God, it happened to you." So call this number and talk to Eric. So I called Eric, and Eric said, "Oh yeah, we have had this problem because we were trying to fit a V8 engine in a V6 compartment. And in the process, we routed the fuel line very close to the windshield washer heater. So if the fuel line leaks, the fumes collect around the heater, and as the ambient temperature goes up, it ignites. Too bad. So yours is the 8th car that caught fire, and headquarters is waiting for 10 before they issue a recall." So I said, "Oh my God, bad luck, right?" Yeah. So we moved out of the house and we had to go rent a place. Then the next morning, the corporation sends an expert to examine the fire. So the expert comes with his people. And I noticed that this expert is a professor of physics from University of Pennsylvania, very well respected academic. And I noticed that he's looking at everything except the car. I'm telling you this story because this is illustrative of how the current system works. Okay? So he's looking at everything except the car. So I went to him and I said, Professor Kazmachik, I already spoke to Eric. And Eric told me how it happened. So why are you looking at all these other things? And he got very upset with his people. He said, how can I do my job if you're giving away numbers like this behind my back? This fellow is calling everybody and he knows what's going on. His job was to find an alternate story for the fire. That's the system we are in. It's a system of competition and secrecy and lies. It is so systemic, it's built in. And we don't even think about it. We think this is normal. This is the way we have to operate as a society. So anyway, within 2 months I got a recall notice. So I sent it to the insurance company. And the insurance company went to court. The court case took 4 years to resolve. This house cost us about $300,000 to rebuild, but the court case was for $4 million. Because the lawyers were billing each other and they inflated this lawsuit. And after 4 years, the two parties agreed to settle on a no-fault basis. There's no fault of anybody for this fire, on 40 cents on the dollar. So you can see the enormous waste that's built into this system. So Donella Meadows was one of the foremost system scientists in the world. She passed away recently, unfortunately. She wrote The Limits to Growth in 1972. She's one of the major authors of that. And then she wrote the 30-year update. And in the 30-year update, she said that 99% of human activities today are unnecessary and wasteful. You might as well not do it. So when you have a systemic problem like this, you have to change the system. The only way to deal with it is to figure out how do we live? How do we relate to each other? How do we relate to animals? How do we relate to the environment? And how do we tell the story of ourselves so that we live in harmony with the earth and we are not creating all this waste? And clearly, if 99% of what we are doing is wasteful, we can live in a way that is sensible, and at the same time, it's not going to be completely a tofu and sandals lifestyle, as Al Gore calls it. So, when I started working on the environment, the first thing I did was to find a location where I could go study the problem. I went to this place in India. It is a village at the edge of the Thar Desert. And if you notice, this is a satellite map of the world, and the desert that starts at the western edge of Africa goes all the way into India. It's one contiguous desert. And it goes all the way into China and becomes the Gobi Desert. And if you remember your history, this is exactly where the ancient civilizations of the world were. Yeah. So civilizations happened, and the forests turned into deserts. So it's sort of built into the way we live. There's something about the way we live that caused this to happen. So I went there to study this problem. Because at the edge of the Thar Desert, you can actually study the three major environmental problems that Gus Smith identified. Biodiversity loss, ecosystems collapse, and climate change, all in one spot. So I went to this village, and these people who were in the village, they used to be hunter-gatherers about 50 years ago. Now the forest is dying around them, and so they're doing other things. So they are now raising crops, and they're raising livestock, animals, food animals, and they're using those food animals to get some revenue for themselves. So I went there to talk to them, and the first thing I did was to bribe them. Okay, I went there with solar lights. I thought I could I could create a business model where I was giving them solar lights and claiming carbon credits for all the kerosene they are not burning and use that to pay for the lights. So that was the reason I went there. And they came because they knew they were getting something for free. And within half an hour after I reached the village, my business model fell apart. Because these people said, what lights? We don't use any lights. We don't use any kerosene lights. Why do you want to change the night? God gave us night so we can go to sleep. And I said, so what are you using all this kerosene for? Because I know you get 3 liters a month from the ration shop. They said, we use it to start our cooking fires. So I asked them, so how much wood do you burn for cooking? And it was 10 kgs a day. So I did my calculations, 10 kgs a day, 30 days, 300 kgs a month versus 3 liters a month of kerosene they were getting from the ration shop. So I had a much bigger problem on my hands. So I said, if I can give you solar cookers, will you use them? They said, sure, show us how to make our food and we'll use them. That's how I got to learn how they cooked. And I began to understand what was going on, the dynamics of cooking. The first thing I realized is that in the village, the women live 8 years less than the men on average. Because they are the ones who cook. If you look on the right, you will see how black the wall is. That's how her lungs are too. Because she's breathing it in every day. So we calculated that she is breathing the equivalent of 2 packs of cigarettes a day, just by cooking twice a day. And that cooking smoke, that smoke from the wood, actually has all of our industrial effluents. It has dioxin, furan, benzopyrene, you name it. Every industrial effluent is there in the smoke. You can measure it. Because everything we put up in the air comes down in the rain somewhere and is absorbed by trees and plants and vegetation. So the trees are very good filters. So they filter all these chemicals out and they store them in their trunks. And they try to transpire just pure water. This is nature's way of filtering our mess. And these women were cutting the branches and burning them. So they were getting it in their lungs as well. So I realized if that smoke is so toxic, then the vegetation must also have all these industrial chemicals. Which means if the animals are eating them, the animals should be storing them in their fat tissues. So animal foods are going to be much more toxic than they were before. So why aren't rich people also getting the same sickness? Because they are the ones who are drinking the milk from this land, and they are the ones who are eating all the goats that these people raise. And I realized, yes, rich people are also getting sick. We are also getting sick. But we have the benefit of pharmaceuticals. And they don't. That's why they die. And it was very quickly I understood how biodiversity loss and ecosystems collapse and climate change were all related to animal agriculture. It's actually quite obvious when you look at it. You see how the land here is barren? Anything new that grows is eaten by cows. And whatever the cows don't eat, the goats come and eat it. So then the people milk the cows and they sell the milk. So the milk, along with the milk, goes all the nutrients from the forest. And it goes into the cities where it's consumed. And the people who consume all this then poop into the sewer, which goes into the ocean. So we are transferring nutrients and biomass from the forest into the ocean. And it's linear, nothing comes back to the forest. So we raise goats, and then they sell the goats. The goats are eaten in the Middle East. Because Rajasthan, this state, is the largest exporter of mutton to the Middle East. So the nutrients from the forest are disappearing into the Middle East, where it's eaten by people who then send it into the sewer, back into the ocean. So if you keep taking biomass out of the forest, the nutrients out of the forest every year, obviously it's going to die off. And there is nothing here for the deer to eat once the cows and goats are finished. So the deer dies. If the deer dies, the tiger dies. And the whole ecosystem collapses. So I could see biodiversity loss happening in front of my eyes. I could see ecosystems collapse happening in front of my eyes. If you keep taking this out, eventually it will become a desert. That's what was going on. But this happens to be some land, 250 acres of land that they protected in 2002 with a stone fence. They gave me this picture when I first went to the village, and to show me what they could do. So they protected this land in 2002, and by 2006 it became that. You see, the earth is a self-healing system. But for the earth to heal, we have to act right. They just took animals out. The cows and the goats were not allowed to go in there, and the forest came back. So I would show these two pictures in my talks, and people were asking me, are you sure they didn't take the first picture during summer and the second picture during winter? Maybe they were fooling you, you know. So when I went to that village in December of 2008, I asked the people to take me to the forest. I want to see a protected forest. So they took me there, and I took this picture of the fence in the middle. On the right, animals are not allowed to go in. On the left, I could see old cows walking around eating up the forest. At that time, I was a lacto-vegetarian. And I realized, with a sense of shame, I realized that I was the worst offender. Because I was drinking milk, and in order to produce the milk, they were impregnating the cows and getting new cows all the time. And then I was not eating the beef. So the cows were living for 25 years, eating up the forest. So I became vegan on the spot. So I became vegan for the environment. And within a week, I had this huge sense of guilt lift off my shoulders. Because I knew I could do this. And I had been carrying that guilt since I was a child. Because as a child, I had overheard my grandmother talking to my grandfather. And my grandmother was telling my grandfather, this particular calf is drinking too much. He's not leaving enough milk for the children. And my grandfather told my grandmother, don't let him drink to his fill. Pull him away after 10 minutes. So as a child, I knew that there was something wrong going on. But I tried to put it away in the back of my mind and forget about it. And I never did. So subconsciously, I was suffering every time I was drinking milk. This happens to all of us. This is this spiritual uplift that you get when you go vegan. I was at a school in Marrakesh, Morocco last year, and I asked 250 students, how many of you are vegan? And only one child raised his hand, right? Then I asked them, so how many of you would deliberately hurt an innocent animal unnecessarily? And nobody raised their hands. I told them at that point, all of you are vegan by definition. Except who you are and what you do are not in alignment. And when that happens, you are suffering. Just as I was. So veganism is about a journey home to who you really are. And in the process, we get rid of our suffering. So we cause suffering to ourselves and we cause suffering to others, obviously. So a month after I went vegan, I discovered accidentally that I lost all my arthritis pains. So I had no idea it's going to improve my health at that time. So this was 2008 December, and then in March of 2009 I went to this forest in the Western Ghats of India. It's a sanctuary created by a couple from New Jersey. It's called the Sai Sanctuary. So the wife is an American from New Jersey and the husband is an Indian. So they decided in 1995 that they were going to just sell their restaurant business and go back to India and start this sanctuary. And within 20 years it became something like this. When I went there, at night I could not even hear my sister talk. Because there was such a loud din of insects and frogs. So every part of the auditory spectrum was filled with sounds. It is so lush green and full of life. I asked them, what did you do to make this happen? And they said, we just had to tear down the fences and let the animals come in. That was it. They said the elephant would eat jackfruit in the national forest somewhere and come and poop the seeds here. And along with the seeds would be the manure for a new jackfruit tree to be born. So the animals would come and drop seeds, the birds would come and drop seeds, and the whole forest came back. What used to be a coffee plantation is now this. So everything the elephant did helped the forest come back. The elephant would break a branch of a tree and eat the leaves and throw the branch away. That created opening for sunlight to nourish the underbrush. The elephant would walk on the underbrush and create a pathway for all the other animals. Because the rest of the underbrush is so thick, only snakes can go in there. All the other animals walked where the elephants walked. So every animal just lived and the forest came back and the forest flourished. I asked them, that's it? That's all you had to do? She said, oh, we had to do one more thing. We had to patrol the land and make sure that no human being comes inside. And at that point I felt so small because I was born in this forest. I felt as if I don't belong in my own home, which is a very depressing thing to feel, you know, that you don't belong in your own home. But this is the common story that we've been telling ourselves, that we don't belong in nature. This is the story of separation. So we were kicked out of Eden. We don't belong in Eden because we ate the apple. We have bought into it. But the story of separation creates anomalies. It creates inconsistencies in our stories. And when we have inconsistencies in our stories, we have to block out some stories, we have cognitive dissonance, and we suffer. And one of the inconsistencies that you find is actually quite common among all of us now. If you look at the Catholic Declaration on Climate Change in the Laudato Si, or the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change, or the Hindu Declaration on Climate Change, you will see statements that completely contradict the axiom that God, Allah, or Brahman, or whatever you want to call our deity, is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing, all-compassionate. See, as human beings, we have to believe that the world is compassionate. Otherwise, our stories are a mess. So we have that axiom that God is compassionate and all-powerful. And then we say things like we are destroying creation in opposition to God. So is God more powerful or are we more powerful than God now? There's an inconsistency in our story. So I was racked by all these inconsistencies and say, we have to figure out a way to tell our stories, especially our common stories, so that we don't have these inconsistencies. If it is that human beings are now more powerful than God, let that be it. But if it's the other way around, let that be it. We have to be consistent in our stories. So in 2010, this girl was born in Phoenix, Arizona. This is our granddaughter. We were living in the Bay Area at that time, and I noticed that my wife was no longer home. She would just disappear to Phoenix. And after about a month, she told me, you have to go and see her. There is something magical about this girl. So I went to see her when she was a month old, and I held her in my arms, and I had the exact same feeling of perfection that I had at the sanctuary in the Western Ghats of India. So I knew in my bones that she must belong exactly as she is. Just like the animals belong exactly as they are. She must belong exactly as she is, and we all must belong exactly as we are. So we have to find a story in which we belong like that. See, to me, she was a representation of all humanity, because she's half South Asian, 1/4 African, and 1/4 American Indian. So she had 3 continents in her. So to me, I felt like I was holding humanity in my hands. And that we have to tell this story where we belong exactly as we are. So I went back to the Bay Area, and the first thing I did was I started writing my first book, Carbon Dharma. Dharma is about what is the right thing to do. And it's fairly easy to figure out what is the right thing to do. You have to be compassionate to all life. There's no question. That's the only way we can live in harmony with nature. But it took me several years to figure out how to go about doing it. What is the story that connects this all together? So as part of my research, I found that there is an equivalent to the knowledge tree story of the Bible in the Vedas. The story of separation that kicked us out of Eden, there is an equivalent story. And this story helped me understand what the story of the Bible was trying to teach us. So this story, it's not an apple tree, it's a fig tree. It's an upside down fig tree. And the role of Adam and Eve are played by children, and the role of the serpent is played by a rich uncle. So the story begins with children playing with sticks and stones and rag dolls on the floor of their hut in the middle of the forest. And their uncle comes to visit them. The uncle says, "Why are you playing with these trifles when the knowledge tree is right outside your hut? Go out under the tree and wish for anything you want and it will give it to you. Then you can be playing with real toys instead of these trifles." Children don't believe him. How can there be a tree where you wish and it gives it to you? That's not how the universe is built. So they wait until the uncle leaves, and then they rush to the tree and they start wishing. They wish for sweets and they get them. And they gorge on the sweets and they get stomachache. They wish for toys and they get them. And they play with the toys and they get bored. Fancier toys lead to greater boredom. There was something about the tree that they did not understand. It grants you what you wish for, and along with it comes the exact opposite. Because that's how the universe is built, of dualities. Nothing comes by itself. They didn't know that. All they knew is that they couldn't stop wishing under the tree, and the more they wished, the more miserable they were. Then they get to be young men and women. And now they're wishing for what young men and women wish for. The four main fruits of the tree were sex, fame, money, and power. And with each comes its opposite, and the result was more misery and suffering for the young men and women. Then they get to be old men and women, and they congregate under the tree in three different groups. The first group says, we were so happy when we didn't know about this tree. This tree ruined our lives. It has all been a hoax and a farce. And the story says they were fools, for they hadn't understood the tree. The second group says, we must have been wishing for all the wrong things. If we could go back and wish for different things, I'm sure we'd have been a lot happier. And they were bigger fools, for they'd understood less than nothing about this tree. And the third group was the most foolish of the lot, for they come under the tree and they say, we are so miserable, we wish we were dead. And the tree grants them the wish. And they immediately reborn underneath the same tree, because the tree always grants wishes in dualities. So the story doesn't stop there. It then talks about a lame child who had been watching all this from inside the window of the hut. He also wanted to go out and wish for a good leg so he could walk. But there was such a crowd of people thronging under the tree, they pushed him away. He couldn't get through. So he stood there and he watched, and he saw the tree was making everybody miserable. There was so much suffering under the tree. Both the wishing people were suffering, people who were trying to get to the tree were suffering, all the animals were suffering from all the wishing. Then he began to see the brilliant cosmic swindle that was being performed under the tree. He understood the tree. And with that, he lost the desire to wish. He began to feel a well of compassion come from within him for all the suffering, and he became detached from the tree. So with that combination of compassion and detachment, he was the happiest of the lot. So that's where the story ends. And then we have these things called the Upanishads, where they explain to you what they told you in the Vedas. In one of the Upanishads, they say that wishing child and the watching child are inside each one of us. That is our duality. So it's up to us to enable one over the other. In fact, the purpose of all meditation techniques from the East is to discriminate between your wishing child and your watching child, so that you can identify with your watching child and observe your own wishing child. So it makes it seem as if you want to be happy, you have to just observe in the universe, don't participate in it. So this question comes up in the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the scriptures of the Hindus. Bhagavad Gita, man is asking God, why should I fight this battle? Why should I wish under the tree? Why don't I just sit here and meditate upon you and I'll be perfectly happy? And God says, no, you have to wish. I didn't create a wishing tree so you could just sit there. You have to wish. And then he taught him how to wish. He said, you see, all those people were miserable wishing under the tree because they were standing under the tree and they were wishing for themselves. If you go under the tree and you wish for the benefit of all else, and you say, I don't want anything from this tree for myself, perfectly happy wishing under the tree, and everybody will be happy around you. And as a species, we are the only species that has access to this tree. We should be wishing for the benefit of all other species and not ourselves. And that's not what we have been doing. So selflessness in that sense is the highest form of selfishness. And so I understood that in the knowledge tree story in the Bible, Adam and Eve were kicked out because they ate the apple themselves. If you were using that apple for the benefit of all other creatures, you would still be needed. But you have to tell a story. I have to tell a story where we do belong exactly as we are, even though we have been stupid about how we use the tree. So that is the analogy of the caterpillar and the butterfly. See, a caterpillar is a blind consumer. The first thing it does when he gets out of the egg, he eats the shell of the egg he came out of. Then he eats the leaf that the egg was on, and he eats everything he sees for the next couple of weeks. He's a blind consumer. Then when he gets too big for his skin, he stops. And within the caterpillar, strange things begin to happen. New cells called imaginal cells are born. And at first the caterpillar's immune system thinks that these imaginal cells are foreign cells. So it tries to fight them. And then more and more imaginal cells are born. And the caterpillar's immune system gives up. It starts building vegan restaurants for us. Then the caterpillar hangs under a twig, builds a cocoon around himself, and meditates for a week. And the imaginal cells start clumping together to form different organs of the butterfly. When the butterfly is born, the butterfly is a very discriminating consumer. She only sips nectar from the flowers. And in the process, she pollinates the flowers. She regenerates life. She undoes the damage that happened in the caterpillar phase. And that is the exact same transition that we are on. It's about compassion for all life, which is the basis of all religions. Here is a declaration on climate change that we made in 2017, which everybody signed, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu. You'll see his signature there on the left. And we presented it to the Christiana Figueres, the head of the UN climate change body. And the lady is making the presentation there is Ela Gandhi, the granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi. And as part of this declaration, we had an addendum, 2-sentence addendum. It said, while climate change is a symptom, a fever that the earth has contracted, the underlying disease is the disconnection from creation. And we, the undersigned, pledge to heal this disconnection by promoting and exemplifying compassion for all creation in all our actions. And everybody signed it, saying it is part of our religion. Then a week later, I got a call from the secretary of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He said, Desmond is very concerned that he signed this. I said, why? He said, did he sign on to go vegan? Because he loves his chicken too much. At that point I realized that even the people up there, who we all look up to, they are suffering as well. Because when who we are and what we do are not in alignment, we suffer. So then the main question I had was, how do you explain climate change within the context of this assumption that I had that everything happens for the best, that we all belong exactly as we are? See, climate change is caused by us putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Over the last 600,000 years, we have gone through several gyrations in the CO2 levels and in the temperature. We have gone through ice ages and interglacial periods. And in the current interglacial period, over the last 10,000 years, the temperature has been fairly constant. Except over the last 150 to 200 years, we have raised it up by about a degree, 1 degree Celsius. We raised it up by 1 degree Celsius by causing CO2 to go up in the atmosphere to about 400 parts per million. But you see, every time the temperature went up and down in the past 600,000 years, or even 3 million years, we've gone through this on Earth, there has been a lot of suffering. Because animals would have to migrate. When they migrate, they suffer because they have to compete with each other and kill each other. The current interglacial period, the Holocene era, is the only era in which we have seen fairly constant temperature over the last 10,000 years. No other interglacial period shows this constancy. And if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions today, the story that we are told is that it's all caused by our burning fossil fuels. And if you look on the left most, that's the most recent time, yes, it's true, about 85% of the greenhouse gas emissions are caused by fossil fuels. Only about 15% is caused by land use change, the deforestation that we do. But greenhouse gas emissions are cumulative. You really have to accumulate over time. Because if you look on the right here, in 1850, you'll notice that land use change was the number one reason for our greenhouse gas emissions, not fossil fuels. So if you accumulate from 1850 to today, land use change is actually the number 2 reason for climate change, just behind coal. But we started burning fossil fuels in 1850. When did we start deforestation? You've been deforesting for 10,000 years. So if you accumulate from 10,000 years back, you discover that land use change is actually the number 1 reason for climate change. And that changes the story. So there is a book by Bill Rudiman where he goes through this early Anthropocene theory, where he says that if it hadn't been for humans, CO2 levels would have gone down and methane levels would have gone down. Except humans came along and by doing deforestation and desertification, we kept the CO2 levels high and we raised the methane levels as well. And as a result, our ancestors were the ones who kept the temperature constant for the last 10,000 years. It didn't happen by nature. We were doing it. And the amount of temperature increase we caused by just deforestation over the last 10,000 years, that's shown as A there, is actually greater than the amount of temperature increase we caused over the last 150 years by burning fossil fuels. So we kept the temperature constant by deforestation. Just like the elephant was just living and caused the ecosystem to flourish, we also, just by living, kept the temperature constant. And then in the last 150 years, we have created all the tools and technologies we need to keep the temperature constant from now on without having to deforest. In fact, we can keep the temperature constant by reforestation now. So essentially, we have a role in the ecosystem of the world. It's a global role, and we are the thermostat species. And we can do this by just bringing carbon down on land, because the amount of carbon on land is 3 times the amount of carbon we have in the atmosphere. Carbon is concentrated where the forests are. You can see that in this map. So the dark regions are where the carbon is high, and the Amazon corresponds to that, and the Congo corresponds to that. But currently we're eating into it with our livestock, with our animals. This is the density of cows on the planet. And take a look at India. India has 10 times the density of cows as the US. but India is mostly lacto-vegetarian. So that's what happens when we keep breeding cows and don't kill them. So to understand the impact of our animal agriculture, I've used this analogy of a weightlifter. So imagine you're a weightlifter and you're lifting 5 times your weight above your head. And you discover that you're on quicksand and you're sinking. What is the first thing you should do? If someone tells you, starts arguing with you as to how much weight you should be lifting, wouldn't you say, go away? Because you're in quicksand and you know that your weight alone is too much for the quicksand to bear. So to put that in perspective, 10,000 years ago, the weight of all the wild animals in the world were about 200 million metric tons. That's on the left here. Humans were a tiny little blip on top of that. By 1970, the weight of all humans was equal to the weight of all the wild animals from 10,000 years ago. And the wild animals were down by at least 60%. And on top of that, we are carrying double our weight in livestock, in farmed animals. And people panicked. There was a book called The Population Bomb, and Mrs. Indira Gandhi in India was going around sterilizing people forcibly. So people really panicked at that point. Then the Green Revolution came along and allowed us to continue what we were doing for the next 40 years. And by 2010, human population had doubled. So now our weight by 2010 was double the weight of all the wild animals put together from 10,000 years ago. Wild animals were down by 52% from 1970 levels. And we were carrying 2.5 times our weight of farmed animals. See, but our farmed animals are very young animals. As soon as they grow up, we kill them. So in comparison to their weight, they're actually eating twice as much food. So they're eating 5 times as much food as we do, in terms of weight. So this is the weightlifter who's lifting 5 times his weight above his head. And we are on ecological quicksand because the rate at which wild animals are dying, if you just extrapolate that out, by 2026 we'll wipe them all off the earth. But what do our leaders want to do now? Their goal, their plan is to double animal production by 2050. Which means by 2026, the wild animals will be completely dead, and then our next will be on the chopping block. So the UNEP is predicting that by 2050 the whole world will be vegan. And the UNFAO is predicting that by 2050 we are going to try and double animal production. How can the two things happen simultaneously? So I envision it happening this way, right? You kill them all off, and then we are going to start dying off. So at the end, we'll all go vegan by 2050. So this is the caterpillar pretending that it cannot be anything but a caterpillar. And he's extrapolating out and saying, at some point I'm going to burst if I keep eating like this. And then only my head will remain, and it will start twitching. And we are all competing to see who stays in the head. Instead, the butterfly story, this causes problems. These are the 3 documentaries we did, showing that if you take all the toxins we pour into the environment, that's in the human experiment, and then that works its way up the food chain. So we convince rich people to eat animal foods. And as people prosper in developing countries also, we are persuading them to eat animal foods. And as they eat it, they get sick because they get all these toxins in their food. And then we fix them with pharmaceuticals. And every step of the way, people are making money. This is why no one wants to talk about it, because there is so much money involved. Instead, if we become the butterfly, drop our weight, then by 2026, hopefully we'll have the same amount of wild animals that we did in 2010. So we can maintain our wild animal population and then let them flourish again. This is the butterfly story that I'm trying to tell. And the good news is it's already happening. If you look at the concentration of vegans, Self-reported vegans are about 6% in the US by 2010. And between 2010 and 2016, the interest in veganism has tripled. Even though I haven't seen a new survey, and the interest is happening in all the rich countries of the world, which means it's a lasting movement. It's not going to go away. And even religions are now getting involved. The Hindu Declaration on Climate Change was the first major religion declaration that asked everybody to go vegan. But we have to do a system change where veganism fits. We can't have vegan consumerism anymore. We have to come into alignment with the planet. And rather than trying to fight the current system and try to bend it towards where it needs to be, Buckminster Fuller said the best way to do a system change like this is to build a new one in parallel. Build a new one in parallel that is so attractive that everybody abandons the old one and comes along with the new one. And that's what we're working on. So we have a project called the Sacred Lifeline Project. We made a proposal to the MacArthur Foundation to have 80 acres of land where we have a demonstration community that is zero waste and off-grid, where we measure our ecological footprint and we show that if all 7.5 billion people live like this, we will only use up half the earth. So the other half can be returned back to wildlife. So the idea is that you would share a lot of things, so it's a sharing economy. You'll see tiny homes or humble homes surrounding a community kitchen and a greenhouse in between where we are growing all our food. So anyway, this didn't get funded. They said it's too radical. And so now we have made a proposal to the city of Tempe to do this in Arizona in one small plot. It's just one section of that. So there's 13 homes surrounding a community kitchen and a garden in between, where we have shared transportation, and it's right next to ASU. So the students are willing to come and live there and help us write the process infrastructure and the software infrastructure you need for the new system. So it's a picture of what it looks like. So this one they're going to announce by the end of this month, whether we won this or not. And that's what my granddaughter looks like now. And I promised her that when she's 16 years old, in 2026, she will be able to dance. She doesn't have to cry. So I wrote these two books, Carbon Dharma and Carbon Yoga. And this is Vegan World 2026.